Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is all about serious thinking for a serious church. I'm Jordan Stefaniak, host of Kiffin's Keep and president of the London Lyceum, and as always, I'm excited to be here with you all. Today, before we get started, just a quick reminder on a couple of things. First, like the video if you enjoyed the content. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the great stuff that we're producing all the time for you. And then make sure to drop a comment if you agree, disagree, or you have other ideas or thoughts that maybe I didn't think about. And then lastly, as a reminder, if you have other questions or ideas, you can jump onto the website, thelondonlyceum.com/kiffins-keep, and you can drop me a message there. Look forward to hearing from you. You can always ask me if you want me to talk about a particular topic or idea. Happy to do that. Now, for today's episode, I'm planning on talking about confessional subscription in particular. And the reason for that is, I guess, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, if you follow along with our online content, I posted an essay. I didn't post it. I wrote an essay and it was posted as of the recording yesterday. I'll drop a link in the notes on confessions and the use of confessions, particularly in Baptist life and particularly as it relates to the OG B.H. Carroll. In some measure, that was a response essay. In other ways, it was supposed to be a constructive, let's see how I think an alternative vision fits the historical facts of somebody like Carroll's life, fits Baptist life, and just fits wise, prudent use of confessions and just healthy institutions and churches and everything. For this in particular, I want to deal with the thorny issue of confessional subscription. There is a reality, and I think it's quite clear in the essay that I'm interacting with, in the essay that I wrote, that there is a fear of confessions being used as weapons to bludgeon one another with, instead of confessions being used as a sort of like a partnership tool to protect one another. In my mind, confessions are designed to be partnership, to help partner and build up and protect one another, and they're not designed as weapons to beat each other with. Now, as always, there are humans involved, and so people are going to beat each other up with one thing or another. They're going to beat their pruning hooks into, or they're going to beat their plowshares back into pruning hooks. Is the idea. People are dumb. So I wrote this essay, and I've also done a previous episode, if you follow along with Kiffin's Keep, on confessionalism, and it was on why confessionalism, and I think I gave like 6 different reasons why you should be confessional. I'll drop a link into that. I don't want to cover all these things. My main topic here is thinking about what does it look like to subscribe to a confession? How much do you need to subscribe to it? How little do you need to subscribe to it to be truly confessional or to be using it, confession, for all it's worth? Now, as I noted, there is a lot of anxiety over confessions in different circles, particularly in Baptist circles. There's this fear of authority. Fear of authority is totally misplaced. And you see this sort of fear, it crops up all throughout the tradition, particularly in Protestants. You can look back to things like the Salter's Hall controversy, where there's fear of using extra biblical words. And that's not just Baptists, that's Presbyterians, that's Congregationalists and others alike. And you've got problems there that just worrisome about, well, confessions end up codifying things that aren't in the Bible. I understand sort of the impulse there and the genuineness that can be there, that you don't want to bind people's consciences to things that aren't in the Bible. That makes sense. I understand it, but ultimately it's really a sort of a biblicistic approach to confessionalism, where we want to reject confessions as human products. And there's a worry that if we use it as an authoritative tool in any sense, then it's going to become a sort of a, I don't know what the right term. It's going to be authoritarian. It's going to suddenly usurp the role of Scripture, and it's going to have a place in the life of the church or life of the institution or whatever that is going to be above Scripture. I think that's just wrong-headed to think about confessions. That's not what confessions do. That's not what confessions are supposed to do. While there is a stream in the tradition that's going to elevate confessions, or things like confessions creeds that are obviously more robust and substantial, but they're going to elevate them to on par with Scripture in some ways. You get a Roman Catholics, and they're going to say, well, the tradition is like the authoritative interpretation of what's going on in Scripture, and you can't go against it. That's not what Protestants think, obviously. Protestants are going to say, well, no, the Bible is the final and absolute complete rule on all matters of faith and practice. And yet, confessions are still playing a significant role in both guarding the good deposit, but also building up the church and seeing it grow up into maturity and in all the fullness and stature of Christ. That's what it's supposed to help do. So, in my mind, when we think about subscription, here's some general principles that we can glean from places like the early church. So, the patristic fathers, I mean, when they come to the creeds, particularly the Nicene Creed, they think it's a crime to innovate beyond the Nicene faith. The fathers at Chalcedon, for example, were very clear. They said, accursed is the one who innovates. So there's a very strong impulse of saying these sort of documents that we've laid down, that we've agreed upon, we don't want to innovate beyond that. Cyril of Alexandria gives you a representative example where he has this refusal to go beyond Nicaea, even in the slightest respect. Athanasius does a similar thing. At the Council of Alexandria, he issues a letter, and he quite clearly outlaws those who would, quote, pretend to cite the faith confessed at Nicaea, but do nothing more than in words deny the Arian heresy while they retain it in thought, end quote. So I think the idea here is that these creeds matter. What they say matters. The grammar matters. Using the right words matter. But there's also something underneath it. Actually meaning what's there matters. And it has importance for the life of the church and those who are involved in it. It has importance for all these things. So let me give you a couple examples of thinking through models of subscription. So I think traditionally you have people who talk about, like, on one end of the spectrum, like a system subscription. On the other end of the spectrum, sort of like a full or just a traditional subscription model. Whereas the system is going to say you can reject or modify all sorts of things as long as it doesn't do detriment to the system that's there. Whereas the full person is going to say, no, you got to have everything. Now, in a recent book, I don't have it on my shelf. Well, I have it on my shelf. It's up there. It's the Confessing Baptist. I've read the first half. I assigned it for my class on Baptist confessions and the students found it very useful. I'll try to remember to drop a link in the description. But the first half has essays from those like Tom Nettles and Michael Haykin. I mean, how can you go wrong with that? But in this, Bob Gonzalez has a taxonomy of views on a subscription. And he goes through, let's see here. I've got there's more than 5, but there's like 5 main big headings for him. And he gives this absolute subscription. He has a historical subscription. Then he has a full or strict subscription, then a system subscription, then a substance subscription. I think he gets a little bit too fancy with this. And I think you can really boil it down to, you have a full subscription, you have a system subscription, and then you have a not really subscription. they're not really being used in any meaningful sense. For him, he has this idea of absolute subscription where you cannot deviate in any respect. So that sounds to me like what Athanasius and Cyril and the patristic fathers are saying about the creed. You can't change anything whatsoever. You can't have an exception to the words. You can't have an exception to the phrases. You got to affirm the whole thing. Now, the question then becomes, what do you have to believe underneath that? So, for example, the Chalcedonian definition talks about Christ having a rational soul and body. Now, I would wager that a significant number of the framers there are going to have a more like a Platonic dualism when it comes to the human person. Must you then, to confess the Chalcedonian definition, have a Platonic view of the human person? Or can you have a hylomorphic understanding, where you do have a soul, but it's a substantial form of the body? Could you also potentially have a non-reductive materialism of sorts, maybe an emergent dualism, and where you don't have a soul in the traditional Platonic sense? It's not a substance of any sense. The same thing in hylomorphic, I guess, case. It's not a substance. Can you do that and still confess what's there at the creed? I think you can, but that requires you to move away from the sort of like, I guess, absolute sense that Bob has here. And he mentions this is the classic Protestant view. I don't have any reason to think that's true. I mean, maybe the Scottish Presbyterians are pretty serious about it, but I think across the board, you obviously have the Westminster Confession of Faith being revised. So clearly they can't. Now, obviously there's people who want to go back and unrevise the revision and say that's wrong. That's neither here nor there. But There are also Presbyterians in the 18th century who are writing on their own confessions. So I mean, to me, that's not the classic Protestant view. I think the more classic is this sort of full idea where it allows for exceptions at various points, um, and to some degree that really is a system. So I guess the way I might define system is you really have complete freedom to reject a significant number of things, whereas the full is going to say you can't reject any of the doctrines. You can reject, I guess, you can reject words and phrases. So that means you're not rejecting any aspect of the doctrine. So Second London Confession of Faith, for example, would say in that it says the Pope is the Antichrist. You can object to maybe the words, the phrases, but you have to affirm that that is true. And if you don't, then you would have to take a system subscription model of sorts. Now, there's tierings of system subscriptions, like how much can you give up and how little can you give up and still be confessing this document. And those are good questions that I think require careful consideration and outlining. So I'll give you another example of a framework that's been worked out. And this is from an old essay from Sarah Coakley. And it's in a volume, a series. I think it was like a symposium they did at Oxford or somewhere. And I think her essay is titled "What Chalcedon Solves and What It Doesn't Solve," or something like that. I'll link to that in the description if I remember. And she gives this like 4 framework, particularly for Chalcedon, where she gives what she calls a literal regulation, a linguistic regulation, an apophatic regulation, and a metaphorical regulation. So really the things that are most interesting for me are the literal versus the linguistic, where she says literal is sort of like that robust, absolute fullness sense that Bob was talking about. And she is quite clear that this includes all the ontological baggage. Even if the framers of the definition held to geocentrism, then you got to do it too if you want to affirm the definition. That seems rather strong and not realistic. Then she goes to this linguistic regulation where it's more just a grammatical framework that you're required to use. Utilize the grammatical terminology in the creeds, but you can have ambiguity to a significant degree in the metaphysical underworking. So as long as you use the pattern of predication, you're good, but you can sort of jerry-rig and change up some stuff underneath. That seems like a little bit further down the line. There's got to be something in the middle. And her sort of approach is this apophatic regulation, where in the series of negative portrayals, you're generating positive content. I always find this stuff weird. I know some people like it and think it's cool. It just doesn't make sense to me, and that's fine. I'm not like criticizing it just because it's not my cup of tea. I'm sure somebody would enjoy it, but the reality is I'm looking for something more in the middle to try to help give a fair taxonomy. And her last one is basically like, doesn't matter what you say. So in my head, I've thought about what can you change and what can you not change? Where are you allowed to make exceptions that are doctrinal in nature and still confess to the confession of the creed? And I think what you have to think about primarily is sort of like a consensus sort of framework. So John Henry Newman, in one of his essays, talks about sort of like this consensus idea. Now, he's a Roman Catholic. He's going to be defending Roman Catholicism. But I think the idea of a consensus framework, in addition to the grammatical necessities, is helpful. To where can you take exception to? Well, let's look at where the consensus of your tradition has had alternative or aberrant views in various ways. And if there is less of a consensus on this doctrinal point, then there is more freedom to say, I'm not going to confess that. Now, that doesn't mean, so when it comes to like the actually on the ground works, like if you're an elder at a church and you take exception to a particular clause in the confession, that doesn't give you the license to go teach contrary doctrine in that church. You still must, the point of the confession is to be the standard of teaching, right? And so while you may personally have an exception, that doesn't give you the license to teach out of accordance with what it says, but you don't have to believe it. That's, in my opinion, that makes the most sense. So then you have all the questions of what needs to be confessed for various levels, for church members versus elders versus deacons versus institutions or associations or these different things. And it can get complex and it can get difficult and it can get, I don't know, hairy in some ways. So I guess a couple of examples that we can think through for this. Currently in the Southern Baptist Convention, lots of debate, or maybe there's little debate, over the idea of women pastors. And say, can you affirm the Baptist faith and message and yet have a woman pastor on staff? And I think the majority wants to say, no, you cannot. You have to affirm that if you want to be a Southern Baptist church. Now they have all this turmoil of, well, how are we going to use this statement of faith? Are we going to enforce it at a local church and an institutional associational level or denominational level or not? And there's a lot of pushback to say, no, we don't want to use it at a denominational level. But I think that opens up all sorts of issues. When you say, I'm not going to enforce this, you are still enforcing something. It's just a matter of what is that something that you're enforcing. Because clearly they're enforcing something on, if you have an LGBTQ professing church, they're out. So you are confessing something. There is some sort of doctrinal level that you must subscribe to. My thought is to simply say, cut with the mystery, cut with the confusion. If you have debate over a particular area where you don't feel comfortable, closed communion, for example, there's half the churches in the SBC don't practice closed communion, whatever. Get rid of it. Just remove it from the confession. Then you have a clear, transparent boundary line to say, this is what we hold to. This is what we confess as an association. And you can move forward with it. Another example is the continued debate over things like in the Reformed confessions of God not having body parts or passions. What does it mean to say that God doesn't have parts? What does it mean to say he doesn't have passions? Passions is an old archaic word that really isn't used anymore. Does that map onto emotions in our current terminology? No, it does not. So then you have to think about, clarify, like, okay, what do I have to believe in order to believe what this confession says? Can I change this? Can I change that? Saying that God doesn't have parts is pretty thin. What does that mean that I must affirm? What does that mean that I can't affirm? Can I look to the consensus of this tradition who framed this and get an idea for what they think and why they think it? All sorts of great questions when it comes to subscription. Do you need to have these people outside of it? My worry is that you end up creating confessions within confessions when you either don't enforce particular things or when you enforce things that are outside the confession. There's like a confession outside the confession. Either a confession within the confession or a confession outside the confession. That's my worry with taking too loose of an approach to subscription or taking too strong of an absolute sense. If you take too strong of an absolute sense where you got to affirm also not just the words in the confession, not just the meaning in the confession, but also the ideas and thoughts of those who wrote it, then you no longer really have the confession that you say you hold to is not really the confession you say you hold to. You actually hold to a confession plus all this other sort of stuff. So, for example, Chalcedonian definition, the other ones, it's not just the definition that you must hold to. There's also like approved authoritative readings or all letters that are interpretive grids to understand what's being said there. That's fine, but you just need to like actually be clear about that. You can't just say that I'm a confessional guy and this is my confession if you also have authoritative other documents that are supposed to interpret what's going on there. I think that's actually a good practice, but you just got to be clear about it. And then the confession within a confession is for those who want to be too loose in their confessionalism and say, well, we affirm and require this aspect and this aspect, but not these other aspects. And we won't require this aspect unless it's somebody I don't like. And you know, and on it goes. You're painting yourself up for all sorts of political turmoil when you do that. There's confusion, there is deception, there's power grabs, there's all sorts of negative things that can go on when that happens. So my personal opinion is to have a very strong, robust confessionalism. I think you should have a full sort of confessionalism where you do allow exceptions to words and phrases. And depending on the day, I think you should have the freedom to reject some areas of doctrine. Now, the question is what areas? And I think that's where that consensus approach comes in. So when it comes to something like the Antichrist, I am comfortable saying you can take exception to the Pope as the Antichrist because there's been a significant number of those who say, nope, that was just sort of like a very much a historically located decision to place that in there. And in some sense, you can say that that's true. And in other senses, you could say that's not. And so I think it's okay for somebody to not accept that and still confess a robust, classically reformed confession in good conscience and not have to worry about that. So those are my takes in general on the concept of confessions and confessionalism. I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas. Do you think I've put together a fair framework? Have I missed something? Have I given short shrift shrill. I don't know what the word is. Have I shortchanged a particular view that you think deserves more careful analysis and more I guess popularity, and it should give more love for it? Love to hear from you guys, and if you go check out my essay as well. Hopefully, I mean, I'm trying. These are tough topics in Southern Baptist life. Southern Baptists are my family. That's where I'm at. I like to. I'm friends with all sorts of other people that I guess they're like cousins or something, maybe you nephews and different things that are outside the Southern Baptist family. I try not to just speak to Southern Baptists because I don't want to just do that. But there is a real crossroads for Southern Baptists who are confused at how to think about what confessions do, why you should have them, how much you have to subscribe to them in order to use them. It's just a whole lot easier. If you pick a confession, maybe it's thinner than what it was before, fine. Maybe it's more, you're not going to go more robust. I know that about Southern Baptists. Either use the Baptist faith and message or shrink it up and then just deploy it in its full glory. You should allow institutions or churches, whatever, to take exception where they feel it's okay to take an exception on things. Maybe you have to line those things out. You can take an exception to this model or this article in this way, and that's okay. But I think that you just need to use it in its robust intended sense. These are good things for our good. They're to build up, they're to guard. And I say, let's get back to it. Confessional Baptist is the historic practice. You see confessions not being just used for local church usage. You see it across associational usage. I mean, that's the 1644 confession, one of the greatest confessions among Baptists, the London Baptist Confession, the first one. You have a group of 7 churches coming together and saying, we're going to agree on this. And if you don't agree with that, then you're not part of us. And that's fine. It's not saying you're not a Christian church. It's just saying you're not a part of our Baptist Association of Churches. It's totally up to you to reject that and to remove it. And no hard feelings. It is what it is. So those are my thoughts briefly, hopefully, on confessional subscription. I hope I continue to think about this topic all the time. Not all the time, but I think about it a lot because I think it matters for a lot of different doctrinal debates. And so it's very important to have a well worked out idea on this. So I'm still thinking through it. So I'd love to have your feedback, what you think was useful, what you think wasn't useful, what you think I wasn't very clear on. Your feedback would be invaluable. So I really appreciate you all for tuning in to Kiffin's Keep, and I look forward to thinking with you all soon.